Hi everyone, welcome to Rolling with Ellie. Today I'm sharing my favorite sweet dough recipe that I use for both sticky buns and cinnamon rolls. I will also share my favorite glazed icing that I use on many baked goods like danishes, bun cakes, and more. We will first make the dough, then the sticky buns, then the cinnamon rolls, and then the icing. Okay, let's bake. So this recipe can be prepared in either a bowl or a KitchenAid. So whichever one you're using, you want to add 1 1/4 cups of warm water. It has to be at least 110 to 115 degrees or just warmed it a touch. And then add your yeast, which can either be 2 teaspoons or 1 package of the 0.25 ounces. So after I've let it sit for about 3 minutes, I go ahead and give it a little stir, and then I start to add my dry ingredients. So you want to add your bread flour, your sugar, and the butter needs to be chopped and room temperature, and then I add the salt. So what we're going to do is, whether you're using a KitchenAid or doing this by hand, you want to stir it for 5 minutes. If a KitchenAid, you want to use a hook and stir it on low. And it's going to become very sticky, and that's okay. We are going to knead this, and me personally, even if I start this off in a KitchenAid, I prefer to finish this next kneading step by hand on my work surface. I feel that the butter does get incorporated better. So after you flour your work surface, you want to place your dough on the work surface, and I add flour, but I don't add a ton of flour at once. I just add it as I'm kneading. And as you can see here, when I knead it, I just fold the sides into itself. So I fold one side towards the middle, and I fold the other side, and I press down. And then I do the same thing with the top and bottom, and that is how I knead it. If you don't do it exactly like that in that order, that's okay. Just keep folding it into itself and pressing down. And what you're doing is you're causing it to form an elastic, spongy type texture. And again, you're adding the flour as you're doing that to get rid of the stickiness. So you're decreasing the stickiness as you're slowly adding flour. Then what you want to do is place this in an oiled bowl and cover it and let it sit for 1 hour at room temperature or in a room that is slightly warmer. So now we're gonna roll this dough out to a 10-inch by 16-inch rectangle. And if you're like me, I like to use a little cheat like tape because I do have a tendency to roll one side way too long. So do whatever works for you. And then after you roll this out, what I did was I took some melted butter and I brushed it on with a pastry brush. And here, as you can see in the video, my house was a little chilly that day, so it did seize up. But if it does that to you, just re-microwave it. And then I sprinkled on the cinnamon, sugar, nutmeg all over it and tried to get it as even as possible. If you have a little lighter blotchy spots, that's okay. And then when I rolled it, I started with the longer side. So when you roll this, since you have a 10-inch by 16-inch rectangle, you don't want this roll to be, after you roll it, 10 inches. So you want to start with that from that 16-inch side. And then I pinch the ends to make sure it doesn't open. And then I roll it over onto the seam. So now what you can do is, what I did here was I scored it, but you don't have to do that if you're better at measuring than I am. So you can either use a very sharp knife to cut these, or you can do like I did with the string, and I just took a very thin thread. And just remember that when you're crossing your 2 threads over, you want to make sure they're very close to each other, because if there is a space, you won't get a very clean cut. So now you want to cover these and set them aside, because here is where we're going to do the 2 different methods. And we're going to start off with our sticky buns and make our sauce. To make the sauce, you want to add your brown sugar, your butter, and your corn syrup to your smaller saucepan. And you want to cook it on a low heat. You don't want it high and bubbling or boiling over. You just want a nice warm heat to melt the butter and the sugar, and stir it and let it cook for about 5 minutes, and then add your pecans. And now with it nice and warm, because you don't want it to cool, because it'll get a little harder like caramel does when it cools. So you want it nice and hot when you're pouring it into your dish. So as you can see here, I have my pie dish and my little cast iron. So I'm going to just go ahead and pour these in here before I place my sliced pieces of dough in here. So as you can see here, I placed the slices of dough on top of the sauce. Next, you want to cover these and let them sit at room temperature or a warmer place in the house, not too hot, just warmer, for about an hour until they double in size. If the space is a little bit warmer, they will rise within 45 minutes, and you want them to look like this. They're almost about double in size, and now they are ready to go into the oven, a preheated oven of 375 degrees. So these baked for about 28 minutes and they got nice and golden brown, but you don't want them too golden brown because you don't want them to dry out. So like you see here is pretty good where they're browned on top, but not all brown. You just want the insides cooked, the tops slightly browned, and then they're ready to come out. Now we're gonna get ready to flip these over. And remember that this sauce is a caramel, so if it cools, it's gonna get hard. You wanna do this when it's nice and hot. And if you do serve these in this dish, you wanna make sure they're warm before you serve them, otherwise they'll be hard to get out. So you wanna loosen your sides, and then you just wanna flip them over onto your tray. And like I said, you want it to be nice and hot. And I have always had a little bit of pecans and sauce stuck to the inside of the pan. So for me, that's normal. I just usually just scoop it out and throw them on top. And here it is. Oh my gosh, isn't it beautiful? It is as good as it looks, trust me. So I'm going to show you how to make the glaze shortly, but right now I wanted to skip onto the cinnamon rolls. Now let me just say here, traditionally for cinnamon rolls, you do not add this sauce like I added here. I just did this because I was bringing these to work and I wanted to do a twist. Now, if you're just making cinnamon rolls, you would just do these rolls like we did in the first segment, and you want to place them into your parchment lined or oiled pan, and you're going to do the same thing. You're going to let them sit and rise for an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the temperature of your room, and then bake them the same way. And what you're going to do for these is once they are baked, you're going to let them cool before you ice them because you don't want your icing to melt. Okay, so now for this glaze, this is a pretty easy recipe. It's really just powdered sugar, melted butter, milk, and vanilla. And if you need to let this sit aside, you want to make sure that it's covered. And if it does get a little stiff because it does have butter, if the butter cools, you can just nuke it just for a few seconds and then go ahead and pour. And look at that, so delicious. And I do also want to say that I like my desserts very sweet. So for the sticky buns, I like a lot of the glaze on it, but not everyone does. For some, it is a little too rich. So please keep that in mind when putting the icing on. If you are serving this to others, you may even want to just taste it. So that's just something to think about. I've also placed a cream cheese icing recipe in the description that I will be showing you how to make in an upcoming video, which is my carrot cake. So everyone, I hope that you enjoy this recipe as much as I do and others that I have made this for. So I want to thank you again for rolling with Ellie. And if you have any questions, drop it in the comments. Thank you again for watching. See you on the next one.